Great. Thank you, Jeff. Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's briefing. I have a whole bunch of stuff to cover for you that I think will be very insightful. So we're going to jump right in. What I'm going to do in a moment is I'm going to turn my camera off, but I will come back with you on camera during our Q&A portion. What I'd like to remind you of, if you'd like to ask questions at the end of today's briefing, you can do so by either using the chat feature here in Zoom. However, we will also have the opportunity for you to ask questions verbally if you'd like to do that. So we'll do that at the end of my presentation. So again, you can use the chat feature here in Zoom, or you can be able to unmute yourself and ask a question verbally. So with that being said, let's dive in here. So I want to start by talking a little bit about what I'd like to cover today. I'd like to start with, as Jeff mentioned, some latest updates and information that we have on the Osha COVID vaccine mandate, which will be taking the form of an emergency temporary standard to be issued in, anywhere from 3 to 8 weeks, probably. So we'll talk about that latest information, and then we'll go from there into the legislative update. There's a lot of questions about what Congress is up to, particularly with the bipartisan infrastructure bill, reconciliation, and what's going on with that. What are the Democrats up to there for that? There's a big question about tax increases and the proposals around there. So we're going to talk about that along with some other provisions that are contained in those proposals. And then we'll get into specifically about what NDA does from an advocacy perspective. We will talk about the work we've done so far this year, and then we'll get into some things we're looking at for the rest of the year. So it'll be a pretty comprehensive update today. And like I said, if you'd like to ask questions, feel free to use that chat feature, or you can unmute yourself later during the Q&A portion. So let's jump right into some information on the COVID-19 emergency temporary standard. So as many of you know, and as NDA reported, earlier this month, President Biden announced that there would be a new vaccination mandate for employers that will be administered by the Department of Labor through an emergency temporary standard. This requirement will apply to employers that have over 100 employees, and that will require that those employees be fully vaccinated, or if they are not for some reason, they would have to undergo weekly COVID testing to ensure that they are COVID negative. Now, the information about this right now is very limited because of the way that emergency temporary standards work. But we do have some preliminary information that we received from Osha, which I'll get into in a minute. What I also want to mention is they've floated the idea or stated that the ETS will outline specifics about penalties, and that will be fines of up to $14,000 per violation, meaning per employee who is unvaccinated and not producing a negative COVID test. Now, of course, there are a lot of questions there. Who is supposed to be paying for tests? How is, this is going to have a negative impact on certain workforces for certain employers. There are a lot of problems with the way that this is going to be implemented, and that's something NDA is really taking very seriously. So we're going to get into what NDA is doing and, like I said, the latest information that we have. So after the Biden administration announced this, we were asked to participate in a very high-level briefing with other industry stakeholders from OSHA. The call was administered by OSHA, and they were trying to provide some information about this. The information was very, very limited, but we did get some information that I think would be useful for you to know. First of all, the range of time for the ETS to be issued is somewhere between 2 and 8 weeks. That's probably a best guess. We don't have any precise date or a more narrow time frame for when this emergency temporary standard will be issued. When the standard is issued, it will be made effective right when it's issued. Now, the unique thing about an emergency temporary standard is it works different from the established rulemaking process. Normally, federal agencies are required to follow the Administrative Procedure Act. This requires them to publish proposed rules, solicit public comment from the regulated community and the public, and consider those. In some cases, they have to form what are called sub-briefa panels, which is where that they provide the opportunity for small business representatives to specify what the effect on their businesses will be. When promulgating an emergency temporary standard, they do not have to follow that process. They are able to fast track a standard or a regulation that will be effective immediately. There are limits in how they can keep that in effect for a period of time, but they're allowed to promulgate that very quickly. So that being said, when the ETS is issued and published, that is when OSHA will be providing a real robust opportunity for stakeholder input, including from NDA. Now, what I want to specify too, there's a couple things that OSHA did say about the ETS, and this is kind of the most detailed information we have right now. The 100 employee threshold is going to apply to employee count for the employers, not for work sites. There was a big question about, well, what if I have less than 100 employees, but we work on a site that has 100? Does that mean this applies to us? And OSHA has stated that the answer is no, it applies to employers. Now, there are still some unanswered questions about that. What type of entities are going to be considered an employer? That's going to remain to be defined by the ETS when it comes out. In addition, the testing and vaccination requirements will not apply to employees that are working remotely or employees who are physically isolated from others. So there was the immediate question of, well, what if these certain people in my workforce are working remotely? Do they still have to get a COVID-19 test every week if they're not coming into contact with any other employees? And OSHA has stated that the answer is no, they will not have to. And so in that case, they're going to, we don't know how yet, but they're going to define the specifics about, this will not apply to remote work, and that'll again be sorted out in the ETS when we have our hands on it. So that's kind of the latest information that we have on the specifics. There's a lot of unanswered questions, I know. So we're going to be really trying to stay close to this with OSHA. And even until then, we're going to be working through NDA's Government Affairs Committee to really digest this a little bit more, craft some of our messaging. We already have policy on these types of issues, but we want to be a little bit more precise and a little bit more able to weigh in with the agency to represent the industry. So we'll be doing that. So like I say, we're going to be reviewing those requirements set forth by the ETS when OSHA makes it available. They're very tight-lipped about this at the moment, so we'll have to really kind of try to get as much information as we can until then, but most of it is going to come when OSHA just decides to publish this. In that case, what will happen is NDA is going to be digesting that, and we're going to immediately inform members about what's going to be required of them, what specifically is in the ETS, how will this impact the industry. We're going to provide that information to you. Now, in addition, though, we've already engaged with many of the other trade associations and coalitions regarding the impact that this mandate will have on employers and potential next steps. And I can report to you today that NDA is part of what's called the Construction Industry Safety Coalition. This is a very, very strong employer-based construction coalition that lobbies and advocates for many different issues that affect the construction and demolition industry. Next week, we as a coalition will be sending a letter to OSHA outlining our initial concerns with the ETS. Again, we certainly don't have the ETS text on what's going to be included, but we have certainly the unanswered questions that are giving us collectively as employer groups concerns. So that's going to be a great opportunity for us to weigh in as a coalition. And then in addition to that, when OSHA is further engaging the stakeholder community, we will be really working closely with them to make sure that this is a workable solution for all of our members. The one thing too I want to mention before we move on into the legislative update is the lawsuit angle for this. Many of you probably have heard in the news that there are going to be lots of different lawsuits with regard to this ETS. There is a group of Republican governors that have already announced that they will be suing over this, and there's definitely going to be employer groups who are going to go the lawsuit route. So that's going to affect, or I should say quite possibly affect, the implementation of this ETS. There could be an injunction issued by a court which would halt the publication of the ETS. So there's a lot of twists and turns that this could take as the ETS is going to be promulgated and enforced. So all that's to say, there's a lot of unanswered questions. We're going to be staying close to OSHA, and as soon as we have the information on the ETS, we will be making you all aware and let you know exactly what the requirements are in the ETS and any other important information that you need to know about that. So now I'd like to switch gears a little bit and talk about major legislation going on in Congress. There are a variety of things that are happening, and it's ranging from infrastructure to budget reconciliation, appropriations, and these I know are all kind of wonky Capitol Hill type things. So I'm going to walk through each one of these, explain their significance for the industry, what all these pieces of legislation are, and I apologize if I get a little too wonky in my speech. I'm going to try to keep it simple and easy to understand. But there's a lot going on right now with regard to infrastructure that is worth giving you an update on here. So with that being said, I'm going to talk about some of these major pieces of legislation, and I'll just go through each one to keep it relatively organized. So just briefly, before we get into some of the specifics of the legislation, NDA has been working over the past several months on comprehensive infrastructure legislation. So for the last several months, Congress has really been focused on trying to pass a bipartisan infrastructure bill. They are working on that in conjunction with working on a budget reconciliation bill, and I'll get into the details of budget reconciliation coming up in a little bit. This bipartisan infrastructure bill has several different priorities for the demolition industry that are going to be beneficial that we have lobbied for. Broadly speaking, they are things like prioritizing physical infrastructure projects. So that's your typical money for roads, bridges, air, rail transportation, waterways, brownfield sites, environmental cleanup opportunities, different things like that. Improving workforce development and job training programs, really trying to streamline the environmental permitting and review process. There's a lot of different barriers that slow down, many of you know this, that slow down a lot of projects, and they get caught up in some of the regulatory requirements set forth by the federal government. So there's an effort underway in the bipartisan infrastructure bill that would streamline that process and allow infrastructure projects to move forward a lot faster. And then lastly, our strategy also is on rejecting tax increases on the demolition industry. There are a variety of people in Congress, particularly in all in the Democratic Party, who are looking for ways to pay for this legislation. This is a $1.2 trillion bill. There is a $3.5 trillion reconciliation bill. It's a lot of money, and they're looking at ways of raising revenue. Our position is that Congress should reject any tax increases on the demolition industry, period. Especially coming out of a pandemic, this is not the time to be raising taxes on this industry. So rejecting tax increases has been a very, very strong message for us over the last several months as we've been working with Congress. And I'll get into a little bit more of our advocacy on that coming up here. But what I wanted to do was to provide some additional information about the legislation. The bipartisan infrastructure bill is a $1.2 trillion package. This has already passed the Senate by a vote of 69-30, which is a very strong bipartisan showing. The House of Representatives hasn't taken action on it, and I'm going to talk a little bit about the political challenges going on in the House for this. There's $550 billion in new spending for physical infrastructure projects, again, going back to the things like roads, bridges, things like that. There's a big workforce development training initiative that I think is very interesting, establishes an apprenticeship program that would allow for the legal operation of a commercial motor vehicle for interstate commerce by CDL holders under the age of 21. So that would be very new. It includes a Promoting Women in Trucking Workforce Act to encourage more women to pursue careers in trucking, and create several job training and apprenticeship initiatives for the transportation sector broadly. So some very interesting opportunities there. And it does, as I mentioned, contain that streamlining of the environmental review process. It's very technical and wonky, but it would help projects. It will also help housing affordability, which is not a strong priority for NDA, but it is an interesting peripheral issue in looking at infrastructure broadly. I wanted to mention too that we did have a victory in the bipartisan infrastructure bill. So as I mentioned, one of the things that we've been lobbying for several months is rejecting tax increases on demolition contractors. During the drafting stages of this bill, we really lobbied Congress on saying no to tax increases on this industry. And we were pleased to see that in the bipartisan infrastructure bill, there were no tax increases on individuals or small businesses, which is a great thing for NDA. We have some additional challenges going on with the reconciliation bill, which I will talk about coming up here in a minute, but that was a very positive step to see for the industry. So just to talk a little bit about the politicking going on the Hill and the outlook for this bill. As I mentioned, this bill has passed the Senate, in a very strong bipartisan showing, but there is action to be taken on the House side. The moderates and progressives in the Democratic Party disagree on how to proceed on this infrastructure bill. The moderate Democrats, they're in swing districts, maybe even in conservative red districts. They'd like to see the infrastructure bill pass like tomorrow, right away, today. Now, the progressive side of their caucus will only vote for the physical infrastructure bill, this infrastructure bill, if it's passed in conjunction with their reconciliation bill, the Build Back Better Act, which I'm going to talk about in a minute. They're concerned that there's going to be no appetite to pass the larger $3.5 trillion reconciliation bill if they pass the physical infrastructure bill first. Speaker Pelosi has told the moderates that if they get in line on the reconciliation bill, that she'll put the bipartisan bill up for a vote by the 27th. We'll see if that happens, but that was the date that she threw out. So that's kind of where things stand. It's passed the Senate. It's kind of going through some politicking in the House. So lots of things going on with some of the infrastructure legislation there. Now, switching gears, we're going to talk about the Build Back Better Act. This is the budget reconciliation bill. It's $3.5 trillion, and it's separate from the bill that I was just talking about. And the best way to think about reconciliation is it allows the Democrats to pass a piece of legislation without being subject to a filibuster. So in the Senate, before you can vote on a bill, so before you can vote to pass a bill with a simple majority, you have to first meet a 60-vote threshold to end debate on a piece of legislation. So the filibuster is a tool that the minority uses to kill legislation. So because if you have 58 votes, you technically have a majority, but it's not enough to advance a piece of legislation forward. Reconciliation allows for the process to pass legislation with a simple majority. And for the Democrats, if they get all of their senators in the Democratic Party on board with this, and they have 50 votes in favor, the Republicans will all be unified in their opposition to this. That will be 50 votes against. So now there's a tie. In that case, the vice president, who operates as the president of the Senate, which is Kamala Harris, can come down to the Senate and break tie votes. So that is how the Democrats could advance this type of very large package, which has a lot of very progressive leaning priorities, things like climate change, housing, education, childcare, paid leave, these types of things that a lot of Democrats prioritize. That's going to be what they'd like to see. There are $2 trillion proposed in new taxes for individuals and businesses. I'm going to go into what those proposals are in a minute, but I want to specify these haven't been passed into law or anything like that. These are under discussion right now with the Democratic caucus. So the things you're going to see on the screen about the tax increases are not things that have been enacted into law. I just want to specify that. So with that, let's get into a little bit more information here. So both chambers passed their budget resolutions, which set the conditions for that reconciliation process. Last week, the committees of jurisdiction held markups. Now, what happens with a piece of legislation is different committees on Capitol Hill take particular sections of a bill. So one committee handles the tax issues, another committee handles the transportation issues, and they all work separately on crafting a piece of legislation, and then all of those come together into one large bill and then get passed through the House and then the Senate. So last week, the House committees held markups of their sections of the bill. The Speaker hasn't given any indication for when the House is going to be holding a vote on this. And the Senate hasn't done any markups or any legislation. So right now, this is in the committee. It's past committee, but it has a bit of a ways to go moving forward. So let's talk a little bit about the possible tax increases that are being proposed. Again, these are proposals. They've made it through the Ways and Means Committee, which handles tax issues in the House, but these have not been enacted into law. Regarding individuals and pass-throughs, this would increase the top individual tax rate from 37 to 39.6%. So this is essentially a big rollback of the Trump tax cuts that you'll remember back from 2017. It would limit the maximum value of the 20% pass-through deduction for single filers, $400,000, and $500,000 for joint filers. It includes a 3% surtax on individuals, which includes pass-throughs that have incomes over $5 million, and it expands the 3.8 surtax on net investment income. The effective date of these changes would be January 1st of 2022, and that's the effective date for their proposed changes for pretty much all of the tax proposals that they've put forward. Whether that'll happen is very, very much up in the air, but that's the way it's written right now into law. Moving on to corporations and what the proposals there are for tax increases. So this would create it's a progressive system for corporate income. So the top corporate income tax rate would be raised to 26.5%. There would be the 21% rate for income from $400,000 to $5 million, and then an 18% rate for income between $0 and $400,000. So there's kind of a tiered approach there to the raising of the corporate tax. It reduces the deduction for global intangible low taxed income to 37.5. So that would be a 60.6 GILTI tax rate. It reduces the deduction for foreign derived intangible income to 21.8%, which would be a 20.7% FDII tax rate. And it caps interest deductions for domestic corporations that are part of multinational corporations. So there's definitely a sentiment within the Democratic caucus about looking to corporations to raise revenue to pay for a lot of these proposals. Now, in addition, I want to switch to capital gains here too and talk a little bit about that. The proposal that they put forward would increase the top capital gains tax rate from 20 to 25%. It extends the holding period for carried interest from 3 to 5 years. And in terms of the effective date for this, the pre-existing statutory rate, so that's the rate on the books now, which is 20%, that would continue to apply to gains and losses for the portion of the taxable year prior to the date of introduction. Okay, so that's how they kind of say that. That's their way of saying before this date, the 20% rate would apply. So they're basically saying this wouldn't be retroactive prior to that date. Gains later that are for that taxable year that arise from transactions entered into before September 13th, which has to be proven by a written binding contract, they're treated as occurring prior to the date, so they could receive that 20% rate. But then anything after that date would increase up to 25%. Regarding the estate tax, there would be a phase out to phase out the double estate tax exemption on the last day of this year. That would sunset already in 2025, at the end of 2025. And that was from the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, which was President Trump's tax cut bill. So when adjusting for inflation, that would reduce the exemption to about $6 million for individuals and $11.5 million for couples, which is indexed to inflation. Again, and that would apply January 1st of next year, 2022. Other things about the estate tax. So the bill would no longer exclude grantor trusts from the estate tax if the beneficiary is the deemed owner of the trust. Sales between an individual and their grantor trust would be taxable, even if they are deemed the owner of the trust. The proposal that the Democrats have put forward changes estate tax evaluation rules to ignore discounts from partial ownership or lack of control of an asset in determining its value. So with that being said, though, we were successful in getting the Ways and Means Committee to reject a provision which would make changes to the existing step-up in basis provision for family-owned businesses. So there are some Democrats who support really making significant changes to the step-up basis provision that would really affect the way that family-owned businesses are taxed. And particularly on the Senate side, the Senate Finance Committee Chair Ron Wyden is supportive of that. However, we had conversations with Ways and Means, and they ended up rejecting that proposal in their bill, which was very positive to see. So that's a good thing. There are still, of course, a lot of other variables going on here with taxes that we would be opposed to, but that was a step in the right direction. And I'm going to get into a little bit about what NDA is doing for lobbying coming up. So just a couple other brief provisions. It provides 12 weeks of universal paid family and medical leave for all U.S. workers. There's a piece of, there's a tax credit called the low-income housing tax credit, which goes into the construction, or in some cases, the remediation of affordable housing. So there's some money there for that type of stuff. It provides 2 years of tuition-free community college and increases the value of Pell Grants. There are expanded energy efficiency tax incentives for residential and commercial construction. Many of you probably are familiar with some of the tax credits around things like 25C, 45L, 179D. These aren't huge priorities for NDA, but they're interesting to be aware of. For example, if you know about the 25C credit, it's a tax credit you can get for replacing your windows and doors with more energy efficient products. So there's an expansion of the credit in the Democratic proposal. And then the 179D credit is for energy efficient commercial buildings. It does include funding for the implementation for systems to conduct electronic voting, for union representation elections. It increases civil penalties for employers engaging in, quote, unfair labor practice violations. So we have some questions about that type of language in there. It includes investments for school infrastructure projects as well. So those are some of the other provisions that are contained in the Democrats' reconciliation bill here. So as you can tell, it's a very big bill. There's a lot in here. It's a huge package. Right now it's 3.5 trillion. So it's very large. However, there's a lot of politicking going on with this, and the final bill, if they are successful in getting this piece of legislation through, is not going to be $3.5 trillion. And the reason for that is because, so in the Senate, you have two particular moderate Democrats who are opposed to that $3.5 trillion level. That's Senators Joe Manchin from West Virginia and Kyrsten Sinema from Arizona. They've said, listen, the $3.5 trillion, that's too expensive for us. That House bill is going to have to get changed. It's going to have to get scaled down if we're going to support this. And the Democrats need them to support this bill. They can't lose. They need both of them to vote yes in the Senate in order to pass this bill. Because again, Republicans are unified in their opposition to this legislation. So there's no way they're going to get any Republican support. So they need every Democrat on board in the Senate. So again, this also comes back to some of the disagreements amongst moderates and progressives in the Democratic caucus, and what priority they want to take with this. What should we do first? What should we do second? And that's creating some problems for their ability to pass this. I mean, Joe Manchin has recently been talking about how he wants to push this into 2022. And so there's a lot of questions that need to be worked out within the Democratic caucus if they're going to be moving this forward. So a lot of different things going on with that. It's something that we will continue to be lobbying on. And with that being said, NDA, again, we are very much opposed to tax increases on the demolition industry and some of these other provisions that are in this Build Back Better Act that would have a negative impact on our members. And I want to go over some of the resources that NDA uses to lobby on behalf of the industry. First is our Hill outreach. So here at the staff level, we do outreach to Capitol Hill. So we talk to, for example, the Ways and Means Committee and Senate Finance Committee. These are the tax writing committees in Congress. There are other committees as well, whether it's Environment and Public Works in the Senate, Education and Labor, Energy and Commerce on the House side. So our direct advocacy with Capitol Hill is a big priority for us as staff when we are advocating on behalf of the industry. In addition to those conversations that we have with staff and members of Congress, we send official communication through letters that detail our priorities or our concerns in a little bit more detail to represent the industry. Of course, we are working with several coalitions that are engaged on some of this stuff, and in many cases, working as a coalition is very effective in speaking with a unified voice. And lastly, what we have available too for members is Grassroots Campaigns. So Grassroots is where, that's your opportunity as members to get in touch with your elected officials to either support something NDA is supportive of, or to echo our opposition to something that we would say would be negatively impacting the demolition industry. And that's something that's available on our website, excuse me, and is a great resource for members to use as they're supporting our advocacy efforts at the staff level. So for those who have taken action before through our Grassroots Action Center, I just want to say thank you for your engagement there. It's a great way to really interact with your elected officials and keep the demolition industry with a great seat at the table when they're discussing different pieces of legislation. So we'll get into some Q&A in a moment, but I wanted to just go over some of the other legislation that we are paying attention to. So first on the federal appropriations and debt ceiling side. So Congress has to pass legislation that keeps the government funded. Now, earlier this week, the House did pass a continuing resolution that funds the government through December 3rd. So come December 3rd, they're going to have to pass another one. In addition, that CR also suspends the debt limit, the statutory debt limit, through the rest of this year. However, that's going to have a problem in the Senate. So the Democrats are going to have to separate the continuing resolution, which is the government funding bill, and the debt ceiling into two different bills, because they can raise the debt ceiling with 50 votes and not have to deal with a filibuster in the Senate. So that's one approach. So appropriations, debt ceiling, these are things that we pay attention to. Surface transportation reauthorization. Several years ago, Congress passed a surface transportation bill. This is funding for highway programs, transportation. That expires at the end of this month. So Congress, they can reauthorize those programs through that bipartisan infrastructure bill. That's the bill I was talking about before the reconciliation. It's a $1.2 trillion bipartisan bill. They can reauthorize that surface transportation spending through that infrastructure bill. If they can't reach an agreement by passing a long-term bill, they're going to have to do something in the short term. That's very possible. So we'll have to see what happens on that one. What I wanted to do before we get into Q&A here is my last slide, and then I'll open it up to a discussion, is rest of our priorities for the rest of the year. Let me just talk a little bit about that. So we're going to continue to fight against those tax increases on demolition contractors. We are very adamant that Congress should not be raising taxes on this industry, and that is a huge focus for us right now in our advocacy for the industry. We want to also make sure that the Osha ETS and any other regulations that are coming out of federal agencies are workable for the demolition industry and are not going to impose any unreasonable burdens for the industry. And over the last several years, I think we've done a very good job at really working closely with regulatory agencies like the Department of Labor, Environmental Protection Agency, and others where needed. So NDA has great relationships with them. So that's a very positive thing in our favor. So we're going to be working closely with them to make sure that they understand that, look, we're here to make sure that your policies and your regulations and whatnot are going to be workable for this industry. So we will continue on that front. We will be working on that infrastructure legislation, trying to get our priorities there. So we'll be focusing on that, things like workforce development and job training initiatives that we talked about, streamlining the environmental permitting process, that money, that actual tangible money to go out the door from Washington and go into, the different states and get infrastructure projects underway is a priority. So those are the things that we will be focusing on for the rest of the year. And so with that, what I want to do is I'll take a pause there. And if anybody has questions, I would be more than happy to hang out and take those. Please feel free. You can use the chat feature. You can turn your microphone on if you'd like. Any priority, way that you'd like to do it is perfectly fine with me. I just want to say thanks very much for your attention. I know that was a lot of information. Be happy to clarify anything I was talking about. But yeah, thank you very much. Let's take some questions here. So tax increase, what specific tax increases on demolition contractors are you referring to? So that could be a variety of different, that could manifest in a variety of different ways. For example, there are many small businesses that treat their income as pass-through. So if they make changes to the individual tax rates, that's going to affect smaller businesses that operate that way, LLCs, for example. So that's a concern for us. Some members would be more along the corporate route. So there would be changes to the corporate tax rates that we have concerns for some of our larger members. So there's a variety of different proposals that the Democrats have put forward with regard to tax increases that could affect different segments of our membership, depending on the size. And also for individual income anyway, we don't want to see, our members pay more in personal taxes too, particularly if they're a small business owner. So those are the specific things that we have concerns with, particularly the changes to pass-through income and on the corporate side. Let's see, going back to the ETS. Let's see. All this foreign businesses, if they not Yeah, that's an interesting question about the infrastructure bill and the ETS. You know, I think it'll come down to the way that the ETS is implemented. One of the things that it's a source of frustration for us on the one hand because we don't have the ETS text in hand, and OSHA is very, very tight-lipped about what they're going to include in it. I think Jeff was recently, he was just on an OSHA call yesterday, unrelated to the ETS, but for some other business through our Alliance program. And of course, that was top of mind for many people that were on the call, and OSHA just wasn't, you know, giving up information. So we're going to have to wait and see about what's in the ETS, and then that will really help to gauge that impact on us. So yeah, appreciate these questions. These are great. Thank you very much. Is the 100 employee count per pay period, or is it based on a yearly average? That's another great question, and that's going to be decided by the ETS. I wish that I had a lot more information about what's going to be in it, but OSHA refuses to really go into specifics on that. But as soon as it's made available to us, we will be sending it out to the membership so that you can see exactly what's in it, exactly how they're going to, you know, classify employees, how are they defining employer. We're going to get all into that. Yes, so we are recording this webinar today. There's a question about, will there be a copy of the recording? We are recording this, and we will be happy to share it with anyone who would like to review it again later. If they'd like to share it with anybody else in their organization, be happy to make that available to you. So yes. Has there been any mention of labor staffing companies also having to comply with the mandatory labor stuff? I haven't heard any specific discussion of that, but the way that the White House has made it sound is that it will apply to any company other than the government. So any private employer with 100 employees, it will apply to, period. Now, who knows, they could be working on some segments of the workforce that it won't apply to. But as of right now, it seems like they are going to make this a blanket requirement for any private employer with 100 employees or larger. Any guidance on a contractor with less than 100 employees with vaccine mandate, also having a general contractor mandating vaccine sub with less than 100 employees? So that's a good question too. So there isn't any guidance available right now for this. However, as part of the emergency temporary standard, I expect that OSHA will be issuing compliance guidance so that number one, it will be, here is the text of the ETS. But number two, here is some information about complying with the ETS to make it easier for employers to do so. And I'm sure that part of that guidance will be aimed at small employers, so less than 100 employees, when they're dealing with certain situations, particularly if they have subcontractors or different things like that. So I'll make sure to make that available to the membership as soon as we have that available from OSHA. We have a question: what implication could the ETS have on workers' compensation claims for employees that do not meet the standard? Yeah, that's interesting. I haven't heard much discussion about workers' comp. However, I have, so to answer that question, I haven't heard much discussion there on the workers' comp side. However, I have been hearing discussions about the ETS requiring employers to provide paid leave for either going to get vaccinated, not feeling well after getting vaccinated, or taking someone else, like a family member, to get vaccinated. That we have some concerns about that, how that would work, and this obligation by an employer to provide that. So that made me think of that. It's not a workers' comp issue specifically, but it's along the same lines of some concerns about the requirement around paid leave and some concerns about, you know, labor there for our members. And so that's something that we'll be really paying attention to moving forward. These are great questions. I really appreciate it. I wish I had more information on the ETS, but it's very difficult with OSHA not sharing the information. They're not required to by law, so they're being very tight-lipped right now. And so it's tough to anticipate what they'll do. But with the information we have, hopefully that can be a little bit helpful at the moment. I appreciate it. Will the ETS be enforced through any agency besides OSHA, or can we safely assume this will be enforced about as effectively as the silica standard? Right now, all indications are that this will be enforced by OSHA. And I think they've set it up that way on purpose because OSHA has the infrastructure and the staff, and they have that background in doing enforcement. So I don't anticipate right now anything can happen, but I think it's very unlikely that they would be involving any other agencies to deal with enforcement. So I think it'll be all OSHA doing it. And it is an interesting question about how enforcement will take place. They haven't made any indication about how it will, whether they're just going to be showing up, demanding to see records or something like that. That has to be worked out in the ETS. That's another thing that we have concerns about, and just, what's enforcement going to look like? What's going to be the phase-in period for employers to, update their policies or to really start complying with this? How are employers supposed to comply in terms of enforcing their policy with their workforce? So these are things that we are paying attention to with the ETS, and we'll be weighing in with OSHA when we get the text of that ETS. So thank you for those questions. These are great. We got another one. Are we looking for comments for your letter to OSHA of how this will affect demolition contractors? Yes, great question. So what we are going to do, and this is where I want to thank those who are on our call today, who are members of NDA's Government Affairs Committee. So NDA's Government Affairs Committee is the committee here in our organization that really helps to, number one, set NDA policy and set NDA priorities, provide me with the guidance from all of you as industry practitioners about what issues we need to focus on. What we'll be doing is we are going to be working through the Government Affairs Committee to get all of the information that we need to shape our messaging to OSHA. So we're going to work through the committee on that. And part of that process is going to be soliciting input from the committee on, hey, how will this affect your business? As specific as possible that we can include in our letter. It won't include any company-specific information, but it'll include feedback that we've heard from our committee members on how this will be impactful. So that's going to be a really good conduit for information for us. That being said, my email is on the screen right now. If you are not on the Government Affairs Committee, but you'd like to share some concerns you have, or if you're already thinking this is how this will impact my business, please let me know, and just shoot me an email with that. Be happy to hear from you on it, because the more information that we can have, the better. We have, of course, a preliminary amount of information about the impact, but any additional information from you would be appreciated. So great. Well, these are fantastic. Great. Well, I don't see any additional questions. I'm happy to hang out for a minute. Jeff, do you have any other comments or any perspectives to weigh in on?
No, I mean, just to say next week, and you mentioned at the beginning of this, but next week we will be weighing in with the Coalition, Construction Industry Safety Coalition, on this, and in sort of a preemptive strike, even though they've said we're not taking any comments. And to just reinforce, again, what I said earlier, which is thank you all for your membership. It is your membership that really provides us the resources to be able to do this, whether it's our Grassroots portal, which is on our website to weigh in, or it's some of our other initiatives. We definitely appreciate it, and always happy to hear from you if you have any questions. Kevin had his email up there. My email is jlambert, Lambert, @demolitionassociation.com. And if there are no other questions, we just want to thank you for your time today.
Thanks very much, everyone. Appreciate everybody's attention and work with us. Take care.
Thank you.
Hey, Kevin, you want to hang on for just a second?